Hi everyone, Becca here and welcome back to my channel, or if you're new, welcome. Really glad that you found me. Now if you are not new to my channel, you probably know that I have done this video before. Don't really know what happened, got deleted, didn't have backups. So here I am redoing it. I am doing the Baker Bralette from Petite Stitchery. It also has a tank top version, but I am doing the bralette version and I am going to show you how to make it reversible. So this is the one that I sewed up in my first video, and this is the deep plunge neckline, and I'm going to do the higher neckline, but everything else is the same, and then you can flip it and make it reversible, so that way you get 2 in 1. And this is great because, let me show you. So this is the non-reversible, and as you can see, it looks pretty much the same. All of the seams are enclosed except where you attach the band. So this requires pretty much the exact same amount of fabric, but if doing it reversible, you get a different look. And the only thing that is changing is how you attach and construct the band. So this video will be really helpful for the regular version as well. It's really just at the end where things start to get different, and I'll talk about cutting it out and how you have to do that here at the beginning as well, because that's a little bit different just for the band, but everything else is the same. And if there's a specific part that you're needing help with, you can look down in the description, and I'll have it broken up into different sections. So if you want help with like the straps or the front bodice, anything like that, you can find it there. You also can go into the settings and speed this up if you want to make it go a little bit faster as well. There's always that option. But I will talk about how to do the regular version with the band and how to attach it and do all of that as well. So this really covers both versions. And if you're doing the tank top, you would attach it like the band. You also could do the reversible option as the tank top. You would just need to cut 2 bottom sections and then you would skip the elastic, but you could definitely still do that. But the great thing about this is when I sewed up that first one, I wasn't 100% sure it was gonna work. I was kind of just going with it. I knew I could get it to work, but I wasn't sure if it would work well. And so here, now I know it works well, and I got a couple tips of turning the straps and things like that along the way that I can share with you now. And the last thing that I'll mention is when I sewed up this one, I did actually sew it up 100% on my domestic machine using a stretch stitch. I used a triple straight stitch for like 99% of it and a little bit of a zigzag stitch for the rest of it. But all that just to say, you can do this without a serger. You don't need fancy machines, you just need a stretch stitch, or you could even use stretch thread if your machine doesn't have a stretch stitch, which some older ones don't. So I will put a link down below to all of the materials that I use in it, as well as stretch thread if you wanted to look into that. But I'm going to be constructing this one on my sewing machine and my domestic machine. For this method, you will need to use a zigzag stitch at least a little bit to make it work. But other than that, let's get into it. Alright, to get started, we're just going to go over the pieces we're using, and I am using the same fabric for my main and my lining, which is also basically going to be 2 mains because I am doing it reversible, as I mentioned, but I'm using the same fabric, and just for my one side, I'm going to be using the reverse side because this fabric, as you can see, it has this snake print printed on one side, and it is just printed. So then on the other side, it is just the solid matching olive, and this way my colors are going to match perfectly. So I know that can make it a little bit confusing with having right and wrong side, but I will make sure that I clarify all of that every single time I am doing it, and I might even need to do it for myself just so I don't get things mixed up. I might just put little stickers on them so that I know which one is which. For your pieces, this is going to be pretty much the same even if you're not doing the reversible option. The only difference is going to be your waistband, which again, this is why I love making this reversible, because you need like maybe an inch more fabric on your waistband, and that's really about it. but then you get 2 looks out of the one. So doesn't make sense to really not be reversible. But you're going to have 2 long strap pieces. You're going to have 2 short strap pieces. You're going to have a main and a lining of your back piece, and on your back piece you will have this piece separated. You want to make sure you cut that up here at the top. You don't want them attached, so it will have this weird little lip there. Then you're going to have 2 pieces for your front bodice, a main and a lining, and I am doing the higher neckline. It doesn't change anything at all other than the final look. The plunge neckline just comes down a little bit more, but the construction is all the same. Now, where we get to the waistband is where things change a little bit. So if you were doing the non-reversible, you would just have one long piece. It would be like double the width of this about, and then double the length, all cut in one piece because you just cut it on the fold. Now, if you are doing the reversible, we're going to cut the waistband into 4 pieces, but we also have to add seam allowance. So for this, the pattern has the seam allowance at 3/8 of an inch, but for the waistband, I used 1/4 of an inch just to make the math a lot easier. And so if you wanted to do 3/8 of an inch, you're just gonna have to redo the math and figure it out yourself. But doing 1/4 of an inch, you just have to remember when you sew it to use the different seam allowance on the waistband. But what you're gonna do is you're going to take your pattern piece for the waistband, which is just a rectangle, and at the fold line, I'm going to draw a pretend piece for you here to help to kind of show you. So your pattern piece is going to look like this here, and then there's a dashed line, and then this is your fold. So I am doing the 1 inch elastic. So that is this shorter line here. So to add our seam allowance, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to pretend that this isn't on the fold, and we're going to extend this, our seam allowance amount, because we're going to be sewing both ends of it. It's not going to be on the fold. So we have to add the seam allowance. So this is a 1/4 inch longer. Then we're going to add seam allowance to the bottom, because the way that this waistband is done, it's folded in half, long ways and short ways, to make a casing. But we are going to be sewing it to the top and at the bottom to make the reversible option work. What I like to do is I just cut my waistband as a whole, and then I cut it in half to make the strips thinner. So I will show you how you do that. So what I do is I add 1/2 inch seam allowance to this line. So from here, I'm going to draw a new line, measure down. This is not accurate to my ruler, so ignore the numbers. Right here, this is 1/2 inch, because I need seam allowance on the top and the bottom, because this is going to be cut into 2 pieces, so I need the seam allowance for 2 pieces added into it. So then I just cut this strip, and then you're going to have 2 big strips. And then what I like to do is I will just, if this is my strip here, then you can fold it in half and just cut down that line, which is what I like to do. And then you have 4 pieces that it should be 1/2 inch larger than your elastic. So if you wanted to just double check the size of elastic you are using, you should have the piece be 1/2 inch bigger than your elastic. So I'm using 1 inch elastic, which means that this piece should be 1.5 inches, because I'm going to take a seam allowance at the top and the bottom. And I know that technically when you attach this, it has a 3/8 inch seam allowance, but I don't really worry about the 1/8 of an inch at the top, because it really doesn't make a huge difference. It's just going to extend the band a little bit. But with this reversible method, it kind of helps to have a little bit of extra room for the elastic, just with how we're attaching it. So basically, you can do it like this. You can cut it as one big piece, add 1/2 inch, and then cut your piece in half. Or you could take the width of elastic you're using, add half of an inch to it, and then that is going to be the new width that you need. And then you can just take your ruler, and if I needed it to be 1.5 inches, I would just take my pattern piece, measure it to 1.5 inches and fold it, or I would just put my ruler over it because I use a projector and cut it at that width. But you're going to need 4 of those. So I know that was a lot of information, but really that's the biggest thing for doing it in the reversible method. Real quick, before we get into everything else, I did just want to come back to the band real quick, and I just wanted to note, if you are doing reversible different colors and you want your band to match, so like here's the one that I sewed up the first time, and I used purple for the lining, and I decided your straps are going to have to be one color. There's no way around it unless you did like each strap a different color, but you're not going to have like a front and back of your straps. That's just not realistic with this. So I just chose to stick with the purple, and then I decided I was going to just keep the contrast of the band all the same. But if I was wanting to do the same color, you just want to make sure that then you have 2 waistband pieces of your main and 2 waistband pieces of your lining. So you just kind of have to decide which way you want to go about your waistband and the kind of the final look that you want. But I just wanted to note that before I got any further. And as always, if you have questions about that, don't be afraid to leave me a comment down below. Find me on Instagram, whatever. My Instagram's at Sewbexx. It's SEWBEXX. And you can reach out to me there, and I would be happy to help with any questions. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set aside all of our pieces besides our straps. Now, the first time that I did this, I tried the straps a couple different ways, and I do know now my favorite way. So I'm only going to show you the one way. I'll talk about the other ways that I did just a little bit, just to kind of give you an idea if you're thinking about them. I found the best way to turn the straps because it is pretty hard. So I am going to be having my straps be the solid color. So when I'm folding these, I want the right sides together. So one thing that I did find is to use a little bit of a thinner elastic. So the pattern calls for 1/4 inch elastic, and this is 3/16 elastic, so it's a little bit smaller, not a lot. The pattern calls for a 3/8 inch elastic, and that's fine, but I do find it a lot harder to turn the elastic, to turn the strap. So this is a 3/16 elastic. I got this from Boho Fabrics, which is the same place I got this, and it is a little bit thinner, but it gives you just a little bit more room to work with it. You could even use 1/4 inch if you wanted. Just note, the wider your elastic, the more support you're probably going to get, and I don't really recommend using clear elastic here unless you have one that's really stable. I know no elastic is created equally, so that makes it a little bit harder just with all things elastic. But I tried some with a thinner clear elastic, like the material is thinner, and it was a 3/8 inch clear elastic, and it just kind of curled up inside the seam allowance and didn't keep the shape of the strap. So that's just one thing to note. I did find the best way to do it is as written in the instructions. So what you do is you're going to just fold your pieces with right sides together, and as you sew, you are just going to take your elastic and line it up with the edge and basically just sew it into the seam allowance. Now, if you're using a regular sewing machine, which is what I did the first time I did this, then you're going to want to pay attention a little bit more to your elastic width, because if your elastic isn't wide enough to go over your seam allowance, you're going to have to adjust it, because otherwise you won't be stitching your elastic into the seam, which is what helps kind of stabilize the elastic and makes it a little bit more structured. So that's just one thing to note there. And I will say I did try the method of just sewing it as a tube and then turning it and then pulling the elastic through. That was fine. but again, it just isn't as stable as when it's sewn into the actual seam allowance. So I'm going to go sew these up and I will be back. And one thing I do want to note, before you do your elastic, you are going to want to pre-stretch it. This is going to keep it from stretching out once it's sewn. So just a couple times, give it its max stretch, and this is going to take out that extra non-recovery part of it. So it will stretch a little bit when you do that. And same thing with like cotton elastic, you will want to wash it beforehand because it could shrink, but you just want to give it its max stretch so that it is at its true natural length. And then otherwise when you sew it, it can stretch and then make it longer. So I'm going to go sew these on, and I just like to leave my elastic in a, this one is just kind of in a wad, but if it's on a spool or whatever, I just leave it long and then I sew it, and then I'll just trim it and move on to the next piece. I don't cut my elastic this size. For me, it's easier to work with that way. So I'm going to go ahead and sew up all 4 of these straps using that same method, and then I will be right back. All right, so I sewed up my straps, and the other thing I did forget to mention, the other method is that you could sew your straps and then take your elastic and sew that again into the seam allowance. And that method was fine as well. I did try that on that first one, but it just was not as stable again because the elastic was kind of rolling. If you're going to do that, I would sew it, and then if you weren't already, use a like zigzag stitch or a wider stitch that kind of covers more of the elastic to sew it in. And you also could baste it and baste your elastic on first before sewing it, but I didn't really find that to be necessary. And here's what I was talking about, where I said I just left the elastic long and then I just kind of added in the next piece under it. And then I'm just going to trim each elastic piece, and then I am going to turn them. So turning them is probably the hardest part of this entire process, but I did find, took me a lot of different tools. I did find that using a straw, this is kind of a thicker straw here, this is like one of those reusable straws, and a skewer. You can buy tube turners like this, but a lot of people have these things at their house already, which I did, so I don't find the need to buy a straw and a stick, which is what that is. But if you are looking to buy one and you don't have one, they do come in different sizes of tubes. I will put a link down below so that you can find them. But what you're going to do is I just take my straw and open up the hole, and you're gonna need a little bit of a smaller straw. Like, you can't use a big old smoothie straw because it will be too wide. It has to fit in there. You're just gonna push it down around your straw with about, and I like, it kind of depends, but I don't know, maybe a ½ an inch to an inch sticking out. And then you're gonna take your skewer, the flat end, not the sharp end, and just kind of take this tip and wedge it down in there and get it so it's like pretty stuck in there. And then you're going to just start pulling this down, and again, this top part is the hardest, and don't push this into your stomach because it is sharp, so be careful with that. You just got to kind of work it to get it over, and see it came off. And so I wasn't sugarcoating this when I said can be the most frustrating / hardest part. Push it down, and so this time I'm trying to get the elastic pushed down into that tube, which is going to help, I hope, be able to pull this down. There we go. And then we're just going to keep pulling it down, and so you can see there where it's flipping out, and then just pop it out, pop out the top, And there is your strap, and now my elastic is in there. It is nice and stable. So then I will just do that with all of them. I'm not going to sit here and make you guys watch me struggle to turn these, but don't be discouraged if it is a little bit challenging, because it is. It's not just challenging for you. Like I said, it is probably the hardest part of this pattern. So I'm going to flip these and then I will be back with the next part. I got all of my straps turned, as you can see, and the last thing you want to do now is, once you get them turned, is I always take these back to my pattern pieces and lay them back down on top of my pattern pieces and just make sure they are the right length, because there's a good chance they stretch out, especially if you didn't pre-stretch your elastic. Then it probably stretched out a little bit, and you're going to want to adjust those and make sure that they are the right lengths. But now what we're going to do is you're going to take your two long pieces and lay them next to each other, and your two short pieces and lay them next to each other. And you're going to line up the bottoms, and I am just going to pin them together with a clip. And you want the sides touching, butted up next to each other, and it is a little tricky to get them to stay together. But you're gonna just take this over to your sewing machine and do a zigzag stitch about 1/2 inch from the bottom to about 1/2 inch, and make sure that when you're zigzagging, it's a wide zigzag going over both sides to just hold those pieces together. And you want to make sure that you keep those edges butted up to each other the entire time. And then you're going to just do that same thing on the bottom end of your smaller pieces as well. So I'm going to go do that real quick and be right back. All right, I got those sewn up. As you can see there, I just used a black thread to basically, we're just tacking those together. Now we're going to set these aside, and we're going to take out our front bodice pieces. And I actually ended up, I went through and on all of my pieces, I just put a white sticker. It's just a label that I cut up on the right side of the fabric so that I can easily identify those. So I did that on my waistbands and my back pieces as well. So what we're going to do is we are going to put right sides together, so my stickers right sides together, and line up our arm size and pin those together. You're gonna line up your arm size here and on both sides, make sure they're nice and lined up. If they're not lining up well, then that means you didn't cut something right, so you're going to want to lay them back out on your pattern pieces and make sure that your pieces are exactly the same. And so you're going to sew up your arm size here, and at the same time you're going to do the neckline. So I'm going to also pin my neckline. And one thing I like to do with V-necks to get a nice crisp V is this bottom part I will sew on my sewing machine, or if I'm using my sewing machine, I will make sure that I'm using a triple straight stitch or even just a regular stitch. It doesn't need to be a stretch stitch, but I'll do about 1 inch up from the point so that I can clip this point and then have a nice sharp point when I flip it. Even on all types of V-necks, that's how I do it. I sew this bottom part here, and like this one it doesn't matter, but the ones where you can see the seams, then you can go in and just finish the seam allowance with a serger if you wish. So I'm going to sew up my arm size. I'm going to sew straight stitch here, pivoting at the point up about 1 inch up on both sides of my V, and then I'm going to serge, and I will serge down to about maybe 1/2 inch from my point, then just go right over my straight stitches. But it's really important to just have that straight stitch, the point pivoting at the V, so we can clip it. So I'm going to sew these couple seams and be right back. All right, so I have those all sewn up, and you can see here where I did my straight stitch starting there, pivoted and back up, and then my serger, I just went right over it, and you just want your outside stitch of your serger to line up with your starting point of your seam. If you go off it towards the end, it doesn't matter because the seam is what you're going to follow, but just as long as it matches up right at this point, otherwise you're going to get kind of like a little indent there. Then I just come in with some scissors or clippers and snip it, and you want to get as close to the point as possible without cutting your stitching, because if you cut your stitching, you're gonna have a hole. So you don't want to do that, and you want to get as close as you can. And when you're doing it with any types of scissors, you don't want to put your scissors in here and then just kind of hope. You want to line up the very tip of your scissors with where you want your stitching to end. So where you want your stitching to end, you're going to just snip right there. So like with big scissors, the same thing. You just want to line up the end and then clip. You don't want to do this and then just hope you stop in the right spot, because most likely you will end up cutting through your stitches. But now we are going to set this piece aside, and we're going to take out our back pieces. And I did the same thing. I put my stickers on for my right sides. So we are going to, again, line these up with right sides together. We are going to line up this back circle piece here. And so you want to lay them out on top of each other. And again, these pieces should be identical to each other. There shouldn't be any variation to them. So your edges should match perfectly. So we are going to do this center piece first. So we're going to leave this piece open here because this is where we're going to attach our straps. So I'm going to just start pinning around my curves. Catching both pieces all the way around. And then we are just going to go sew this up. So I'm going to start, it doesn't matter which side you start on, but you're going to start up here, sew all the way around, down, back around, and up here, stopping at this point so that you will have a hole left in this point here. So I'm going to go sew that up and be right back. All right, so I have that sewn up, and again, remember there you have our hole. And this is a little awkward when you sew it. Just make sure that as you're doing it, you're moving the rest of the piece out of the way so that you're not accidentally catching it in your stitches. So this hole we have now, we're going to put our strap in there. So we're going to take the longer strap, and we are going to slide it up into that hole, and you want to push it out 1/4 of an inch past the top. I'm going to pull it out, so you want it to just peek out just a little bit, and then I'm going to pin it in here. I like to sew this with a straight stitch on my sewing machine. It just gives a cleaner look and a cleaner cut at the corners. So I'm going to go sew this, and I like to start in my seam allowance and go all the way through, and I will back stitch all the way across it and then go over it again just to really stabilize that, because there is going to be a lot of pulling on these points where your straps connect. So I'm going to go sew across there and be right back. Alright, so I sewed across here, and one thing that I like to do is I like to just kind of pull it out and look at it, so you can see here where the edge of my bodice is not hitting right at the edge of my straps. This side is worse than that side, and that means that my seam allowance was probably not right, or my straps ended up a little bit smaller. It doesn't really matter, it's just more of a look, but like I can tell here, like here's the edge of my strap, and then right there is the edge of my stitching, so that's what's causing that gap. So what I like to do if I'm having that, I start down about 2 inches and just kind of follow that stitching line. I do this with just a straight stitch on my machine, and then just kind of gradually verge off of that and make it a little bit wider seam allowance to hit right at the edge of my strap. On this side was a little bit better, so I might do it a little bit. It's like 1/8 of an inch, but it just gives it a cleaner look once you flip it right side out. So I'm going to go ahead and do that and just pull these seam allowances in right to the edge of the strap, and then I will be back. Alright, so you can see here how I just went in with the straight stitch and verged off the side. And then now what I'm going to do is I'm going to clip my corners just a little bit, not too much, but since I went through this with my straight stitch both sides, I'm not as worried about my serger stitches, but I'm just going to do it. And I like to leave the elastic in there. It just gives it a little more strength on that strap. You can trim it down and it will reduce bulk a little bit, maybe just even them out if needed to, but I like to just let them stick out like that. One thing, if you did sew this on with a serger up here, do not trim your corners because that will release those stitches and your straps won't stay. But now we can just pull it out and you can just see how much cleaner those points are. So now I'm going to make sure my stickers don't come off. We are going to just pull this out. We're going to just pull this all the way out and then flip the rest of our bodice so that it is right sides out. And I like to just lay it down as I do this because it does flop kind of crazily with this open back in it, and get all of my pieces remotely semi looking flat. So now what we're going to do is we're going to close up the sides of our bodice, and this is going to be done doing a sort of burrito roll method. So what you want to do is, it doesn't matter which side is facing up, if it's your main side or your lining side, but you're going to take the bottom side and just kind of flip it down. And I like to roll this part up so that I can get this bottom part out here. So this is the arm side of my lining, the arm side of my main. So what we're going to do now is we are going to, keeping the bottom section rolled up in here, we're going to fold this up over the top and line up our arm size. I'm going to start here. This is the side seam, and then I'm just going to pin these arm sides together. So what this is going to do is going to enclose the seams so that they are inside the main and lining, and then you can't see them. So now I'm going to just go and sew up this edge right here, and then when you pull it out, you will have that top part of the back will be sewn up and you won't see your seams. I'm going to go sew that real quick and then flip it right side out. Alright, so I have that sewn up, and I did forget to mention, when you do sew this, you want to make sure that you keep this rolled up piece out of your seam allowance because you don't want it to catch. So we're going to pull this out and just show you now. So here is where we just sewed, and now we have a nice clean seam there. Here's our bottom back, and so now we're just basically going to do the same thing on this side here. And so we are just going to pull this lining piece down, and I like to kind of pull my get it lined up like this, and then pull my straps out of the way to get all of that bulk out of the way. And then we're just going to again line up the arm side all the way up, making sure not to clip that other piece in our seam allowance. And then we're just going to go ahead and sew that up again, making sure we don't get that other piece. I'm going to go sew that up real quick and be back. So I just sewed that seam up there, and then now we're just going to pull it out and get it right sides out. And again, we're going to have a little hole up at the top. That's where our straps are going to go, just like we did at the bottom there. So you can see these are nice and enclosed. You can kind of see the seams here. And then up here we have our hole. All right, so once you have all that sewn and you have your little hole here, I don't know if this is exactly how it's written in the tutorial, but that part kind of confuses me with how it's written. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take our short straps, and I'm just going to set those there for a second. And what I do is I just kind of stick my fingers in here, and basically we're going to pull out this top piece and flip it around. So here is that hole, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my straps and just work its way up there. You can use tweezers or something if you want to, and pull them out the top. And then just like the other ones, we want to adjust it so that they are sticking out 1/4 of an inch, and then we'll sew across. And this one I have it in there pretty good, but again, if your piece is wider than the straps, you can just go in with a straight stitch. I'm going to go ahead and sew across here with that straight stitch. All right, so I have that sewn, and now we're just going to again trim those corners. If you used a straight stitch, if you did it on your serger, don't trim those corners. And you can trim this piece if you want. You don't have to. I'm just going to trim it down a little bit to reduce the bulk. And then my threads, and then I'm just going to pull those out, and we have those hooks. So then we're going to lay it out again, and here you can kind of choose. With it being doing the reversible, it doesn't really matter, but because one way it's going to be the opposite. But if you want your back straps to go over the top of the back piece or under the back piece, would determine on how you did this. I think I want them to go over the back on the printed side, just to give a little bit more contrast on the back. So it doesn't really matter, but you're going to put your back straps, you're going to put the longer straps on the outside, and then we're going to take the shorter straps and line up the ends just like we did at the bottom of both of these straps, and we are going to zigzag those together. And you want the shorter strap on the inside when you do this. I'm going to zigzag it about 1/2 inch, and then you'll do the same thing on this one. You want to make sure that these straps don't twist when you do this and that they're nice and flat. So you're going to do that on both sets, and that's what's going to attach our straps. And so you can see here, I have this one is twisted, so I need to fix that. So just double check it before you go and sew it up. So I will go and zigzag both of those about 1/2 inch down, and then be right back. All right, so I have those sewn up, and now I'm going to turn this way. We're going to grab our front piece, and we are going to take our front piece and we're going to attach the strap. So when you lay your front piece down, you want your back piece here, and I have my printed side up, which again was my main side. So I have that facing up, and then here I have my main on the top facing up. So what we're going to do is we're going to just take these straps and slide them up into our little hole, making sure we don't twist them, and again pull them through. Once you get them up there, pull them through 1/4 of an inch past the top, and then we're just going to sew them. And we'll do that on both pieces. So again, make sure they're not twisted, pull it up and through, and then again, just like on the back pieces, if your hole is too big and there's some extra fabric along the sides of it after you sew them, you can go in with a straight stitch and merge those in. But I'm going to go ahead and sew across the top of both of those with a straight stitch and be right back. Alright, so I have those sewn and I trimmed them up and trimmed the corners already. So now you can just pull this out. And I did adjust, one was a little bit too wide, so I went ahead and adjusted that and made sure that everything lined up nicely. So now this is where we start to do things a little bit differently if you are doing the reversed option. But if you are not doing the reversed option, all we're going to do is we're going to sew up these side seams, and this is real simple. So we're just going to flip open our front bodice piece like this so that the main and lining are both flipped out. And then we're going to take the back bodice and just line up the raw edges, line up your side seam here, and then keep going down there. And it is going to just pull a little bit. You're just going to have to kind of work with it, but it should fit perfectly along these side seams. And line up at your bottom, your seam, and then here. And one thing I like to do at this seam is to nest my seams. So that means one seam will go this way, the other one will go that way, and that'll kind of reduce the bulk and kind of create a little lip that they'll catch on. And then you'll just sew down that and you'll do the other side, and then that would sew up your side seams and everything would be together. And then I'm going to pull out this one that I haven't finished yet, but this is the same version, but it's non-reversible. So you would have your side seams sewed up then, and then what you would do is you're just going to take your band, and we'll pretend this is our full band. So you would take your band with right sides together, line it up, sew here, and then you would fold it in half again, right sides together, and attach it around there. Then you would just leave a hole and feed your elastic through, sew your elastic together, and then finish your hole, and then you are done. Then this is not reversible. I mean, you could wear it reversible with the exposed edge. I guess that is kind of the style now, but as you can see, that is really the only exposed seam. So that's why we're doing this a little bit differently, to get rid of that exposed seam and make it reversible. So now we're going to get into what we need to do to make it reversible. So the first thing we're going to do is just lay it back out, and we are going to take our band pieces, and again, remember we should have 4, and this is where you needed to decide what color method you were going to do. And I just decided I'm going to take off all of these stickers. I'm going to make the band green on just the solid green on all 4 sides, because I have the green strap, so that way it's going to coordinate a little bit better. And so what we're going to do is we are going to sew each band on to each piece. So we have 4 bands, so we're going to be sewing 4 seams. So because I want the green side up, I'm going to put here. So I'm going to pull off my lining away from my main piece, and I'm going to line up my band edge to the bottom of, this is my main lining, and it should fit exactly because the seam allowance is included. And so we have that one, and then on this side here, again, I'm going to do the right side down of the color I want my band to be, and line that up. And then I'm going to do the same thing on my back pieces. So down here, I will just put this one on and pin it on, and then I'll pin my last piece onto there. And then now I'm going to go and I'm just going to sew all 4 of these on separately. All right, so now that we have all 4 of our band pieces sewn on. We have to close up the bottom of our front and back bodice. So I am just going to pull my back bodice aside down here, and we're going to be doing kind of a burrito method, but we don't really have to roll anything because it's just our straps, which is why we're pulling this out of the way. But I'm going to flip open my front bodice and have my right sides facing up, and then I'm going to now fold my lining over the top so that I now have right sides together, and line up this bottom edge of our band. This is the bottom edge of our band, and if you did it the way I did it when we talked about cutting it out, just remember that somewhere I didn't line this up well. Just remember that this was a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance as opposed to the 3/8 seam allowance. So just remember that if you cut that, this bottom edge, we're going to sew at a 1/4 of an inch. So I'm going to go sew this up real quick and be right back. All right, so I have this sewn up. So now this is basically a tube, and you can flip it out if you want, and you can see here that the bottom is all lined up, but we are going to just keep it inside out for now because we're going to need that to attach the elastic. And then we're just going to set that aside, and just like we did, I'm going to flip it this way now with my back bodice, and the straps are going to go through. And this one is going to be just a little bit harder just because there is a little bit more bulk in the center, but it shouldn't be too much that it causes issues. So then we're just going to pin our bottom piece together again here, lining up the bottom of our band, making sure we're only pinning our bands together and not anything else, with right sides together. And then I'm going to go sew this up, and I will be right back. Okay, so now we are going to be attaching our elastic, and this is a little bit different than the other way as well. And so what we're going to do is you're going to take your elastic measurement for your waistband, and you're going to divide it by 2 and then add a 1/4 inch. So I'm going to cut the large waistband, which is 30.75, and so I'm going to divide that by 2, and I'm actually going to just go up to 31 because it's a little bit tight on me anyways, and it just makes the mouth easier. So we're going to go, that is 15.5 plus a 1/4 of an inch because we need to add a seam allowance. So we're going to go 15.5 plus 0.25, and that takes us to 15.75. So I am going to cut this, and then you're going to just cut 2 of those. And again, just like the strap elastic, you want to make sure that you stretch it. Now, if you already cut your elastic and you only have 1 piece, that's okay. Just cut it in half and it should be fine. I did that on the first one that I made and I didn't have any issues. It's just going to end up being a little bit tighter than what it is intended to be, but it's not going to really mess anything up. But you could also recut the elastic if you wanted to. But now we are going to just take 1 piece of elastic, and it doesn't really matter which side we're doing, but this is where it is a little bit different of how we're going to attach our elastic, because we want our elastic to fold up into the waistband. So we need to attach this to the seam allowance, but we have to attach it on the top of it. So what you're going to do is you're going to take your elastic, and this bottom edge here, you're going to line up with your stitching line of your waistband, that bottom edge. And I like to just use pins here because you can't really clip it because there's nothing to really clip together, and pin this on at one end and then do the same thing down here. And so like here's the back, your elastic is sticking up over it, and you want your ends of your elastic to line up with the edges of your bodice. And then this doesn't really need stretched too much, but it does have a little bit of stretch as you attach it. So you just pin it on there, and as much as you need. You also could use like a wash away hem tape here. That's really helpful. But then you're just going to take I like to just use a wide zigzag stitch and zigzag this on, making sure that it stays lined up with the bottom stitching line. You know, it's kind of hard to see because it blends in with this fabric, but just your left needle stitching there, and you want to make sure when you're doing it, you're keeping your zigzag stitch on your elastic and not going over into the actual waistband. You want it to all be on the seam allowance, so you'll do that on the front, and then you'll do the exact same thing on your back. And you want to just make sure too that when you do this, you're doing it on the waistband seam, not the seam of the bodice to the waistband, because I could see how you could easily do that, but then it's going to make things wonky. So then you're just going to take this one and pin this one on again up here at the top. So basically you're overlapping it 1/4 of an inch, and then sew those on. So I'm going to go sew both of those on, and then we are almost done. All right, I got my elastic sewn on, and you can see here how I zigzagged it, and I did it a little bit off the edge of the elastic, which is fine as long as it's not off over your seam allowance into the actual garment, or that your elastic is over the seam allowance, because if it does, it'll just catch on the back of the elastic here, and it'll still catch that seam. So it's not a big deal. And just, you know, this one is a little messy because it's just spare threads, because as I told you, to make sure you attached your elastic to the right seam, I didn't listen to my own advice, and I just picked a seam and started sewing, and I attached it to the wrong one, so I had to rip it off and redo it. But pretty simple fix, just a little bit of time seam ripping and then all of these threads, but I don't really care too much about them because they are going to be enclosed. But now we are almost done. We are going to just pull out our piece so that it's right side out. You can kind of check your elastic in here and make sure you got the right seam. That's how I noticed I did the wrong seam when I came through to check it. And it might not lay super nicely here, but once it's on, it'll stretch and pull. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But then I'm going to do the back, which the back is a little bit harder just because it's a smaller space to turn around. And then you want to lay your pieces out, and it doesn't matter which side's up, but you just want to make sure that they're not twisted. So you should have the same side up. So like here's my lining side up on both sides. So now what we're going to do is we are going to fold this in half like it is being worn, and we're going to take one side, and I like to start where my elastic is and just match those up with right sides together, and put these over here and pin those, and then match up this seam here. And I like to fold it down over the top of my elastic just to kind of catch it in there. If it's too bulky, you can turn it the other way. It's not a big deal. But then I'm just going to match it up to this top seam. And here I like to nest my seams, which is where I talked about you fold them the opposite directions so that the bulk is spread out and they kind of hook onto each other to help line up your seams. And then what you're going to do is you're going to, once you get one side of your seam matched up, so you see here how there's two pieces matched up here, and then these are basically circles, and the other sides of the circles are open. So what we're going to do is I'm gonna do it towards my front piece because just it has a bigger area. So we're going to flip this inside out. So now everything is inside my front piece, and we're going to just kind of get it so that it lays nicely in there. It's not a huge deal right now, but so now we have that. So now you can see that these circles are inside of each other, and so this side is all matched up. And then we're just going to go over to this other side here and finish matching up our side seam. So this is the magic that is going to make it reversible. And so now you're just going to go and sew all the way around this circle, starting and ending in the same spot. And as you sew, you just want to make sure that you're extra careful that you keep all of your seams matched up, and that's just going to make it look a lot nicer on the finished product when you flip it right side out. So I have sewn this shut. You can see here I can kind of stick my hand in. And now what we're going to do is we're going to do kind of the same thing. Well, basically we're going to do the same thing on this other side. Just want to make sure that it is not twisted or anything in there. So now we're just going to start. And again, I'm going to start with my elastic, and you want to make sure your elastic is going the same direction as on this side, and same with your other seams. So like I tucked this over the top, so I'm going to tuck it over the top again, so otherwise the seams will twist in your garment. And then we're just going to pin all the way around again, lining up our seams again. And the only difference is that this time we are going to leave about a 2-inch hole in our side seam. And that is going to be where we flip it to turn it right sides out. And so it doesn't really matter where. I usually do it on the side that has the print, if I have one that has a print, or like whatever the thread in my machine is, because you are gonna have to stitch it closed. And usually when there's a print, it's a little bit more hidden, but you just want to do it above the band and in one of the side seams. And I just recommend not doing it like at the top or overlapping a seam. So I'm just going to do it right here on this piece here, and between these two pins I'm going to leave a gap. So I'm going to start here, sew all the way around, and stop here, and then I'll be back. Then all you're going to do is you're going to take your hole, and the bigger the hole, the easier this will be, but the more you're going to have to patch it once you close it up. So it doesn't really matter. I'm going to just pull it through, and voila. So as I was saying, the band is going to look like it's rolling a little bit, which it kind of does, but once it's on, the stretch and negative ease of it pulls it down. But the other thing that you could do if you wanted to is you could pull this band up and just stitch in the ditch here along your waistband, or you could even just do like a hand stitch in there in a couple spots and tack it down to pull it. But I have made it and I didn't have any issues with it fitting or rolling or anything like that. And I have some nasty strings there, but other than that, you're just going to, if you have any strings, cut them out, and then you're going to take this and you can hand stitch it shut. You can do a ladder stitch, or you could just take it over to your machine and just top stitch it real close, like at 1/8 of an inch, and stitch it shut. I like to just do that. It doesn't look quite as pretty because you are going to have a little bit of a bulge here. Like for example, this one, like this way you can't really tell, but this way you kind of can. You can see that. And this is what I was talking about. This one was both solid, so it didn't really matter which side I used. I just used the one I had the best matching thread. But I just find it stronger, and not that it's going to really matter if those seams pop on you, because it's lined, but just you don't want that to happen. So that's what I prefer, and it's under the arm, so nobody's going to be looking at it, and if you do it in the pattern, it's going to blend it in a little bit. But then other than that, you are done. All right, once you sew up your hole, you are done, and I haven't done that yet because I want to switch out my thread color. But other than that, you are done. And if you wanted to, like I mentioned, you could do the top of the band. You also could top stitch the bottom of the band, or you could like stitch in the ditch on the side seams just to kind of hook everything together. But like I said, because of the negative ease, because it is compression fitted and stretching when it's on, it pretty much pulls everything into the right place when it is on. So you don't really have to worry about that, but if you wanted to do that, you can. Just make sure if you are top stitching it, you're using a stretch stitch and not just like a plain straight stitch, because otherwise when you put it on, it'll pop your seams. Here is the one side and the other, and well, again, I used the green for the straps and the band, and this is so cute. So I hope that this video was helpful, whether you did the reversible hack or you just did the regular version or a tank top. But if you have any other questions, feel free to leave a comment down below, and I would be happy to help if I can. You can also find me on Instagram. It's at Sewbexx. That's SEWBEXX, and you can reach out to me there with questions about this, or like if you're stuck on something, you can send me a picture of it there. You can't really do that here, or you can just ask me any generic sewing question, but I am always happy to help with any questions you have regarding one of my tutorials or just sewing in general. But other than that, if you found this video helpful, make sure you give it a big thumbs up and subscribe to my channel so that you're notified of future videos. Thanks for watching. Bye.